the training, the support they needed to be effective and to achieve and accomplish the mission. But we also, had to deal with the real human factors, factors that affect any soldier or uniform officer who goes overseas during the theater of war, whether that war is with visible soldiers or invisible agents like the Ebola virus, which is that there's trauma that comes with it as well. And it took us a while to get a full, I think, handle around the extent of the trauma that was involved that officers experienced when they went abroad, knowing that their life was on the line, and tried to care for people who had Ebola. So these were complicated missions. They're also complicated because in government, while government has powerful mechanisms for implementing change, they're complicated mechanisms. They're big ships that turn slowly, and having to move quickly without breaking something, having to collaborate with multiple arms, of the uniformed services, and especially the Army in West Africa, and with the legislative branch and the executive branch. This took a lot of conversations, a lot of collaboration, a lot of putting out fires. So it was messy, behind the scenes. This sausage making often is, but it was worth doing because it was a key part of turning the tide on the Ebola crisis.
If you don't mind, I'd love to chat a little bit about the pink elephant in the room, which is, just for sake of simplicity, I'll call COVID-19. I understand there's a virus and then there's the disease and so on and so forth. But how are you currently thinking about COVID-19? What are people missing or misunderstanding? Or really, what would you like to share in terms of your thinking related to COVID-19?
Gosh, there's so much that COVID-19 is teaching us, not just about science and health, but about our infrastructure and about society more broadly. One of the key things to recognize about COVID-19 is as we're having this conversation, we've learned a lot about the virus, but there's still a lot we don't know. Several weeks ago, during the early days of this outbreak, there was an assumption that young people don't have much to worry about, and that this is an illness that primarily affects the elderly and those with other complicated medical conditions. But the data that we're starting to get now shows that perhaps that distinction was too stark, and that in fact younger people are more affected and get more seriously ill than we had previously thought. So this is a humbling virus. It's teaching us new things about it, and we've got to keep that in mind and make sure that we approach it with caution and that we err on the side of being too cautious and too aggressive in addressing it. I think the second thing that's important to realize about COVID-19 is that this virus is not the flu. This is a very different virus. It's much more contagious. It's much more deadly. And we don't have any tools in terms of medications or vaccines to address it at the current moment. And hopefully that will change over time. But right now, we don't have those tools, and we also don't have natural immunity in the population because this hasn't been circulating for years. I think the other part to remember here is that every now and then, there's a moment in the world's history where we are faced with a challenge that's far bigger than any one of us or than any one country can solve on its own. And COVID-19 has presented us with one of those challenges. And the question is, how are we going to respond? As a world, how are we going to collaborate to not only develop therapeutics, but also to help each other overcome shortages of masks and other protective equipment? How are we going to share data so that we can learn together about how to prevent catastrophe as the virus spreads across the world? It's a real test, of the relationships that we have between countries. But it's also, and I think perhaps more poignantly, a test of the relationships we have in our communities. We're coming to realize that with a virus like this that spreads really easily where there is no treatment yet, one of our most effective mechanisms of preventing spread is to physically distance people. As painful as that is, as lonely as that can be, it is one of the more effective strategies. And so as we speak, we're currently implementing that, here in the United States. And it is not an easy thing to do, but one of the things that it's already started to illuminate and remind many of us of is that we really do need each other. That as much as we live in a world and in a country, I should say, that's built on an ethic of individual responsibility and that's built on a narrative of the single entrepreneur who builds the company or the single scientist who solves, a major disease and finds a cure. The reality is that we are far more interdependent and interconnected than perhaps those narratives might suggest. And I think that this experience of COVID-19 is a powerful reminder of that. And finally, Tim, I think COVID-19 is pushing us to confront some messy, difficult, but important questions. And questions around what we believe people need to support them and what role government has in providing those supports. So in a scenario like this, for example, when somebody may get sick and they've got to stay home for a couple of weeks because they have COVID-19 infection, what if they don't have paid sick leave? Then how do they take care of their child and make sure that he or she has food on the table? If they're an Uber or a Lyft driver and they're depending on that income in order to help put their child through college or take care of an elderly relative, what do they do when nobody's out on the road taking rides because they're worried about safety? The truth is we don't have as robust a net to catch people and support people when they fall as we perhaps may have thought we had in the United States. And so this, I think, is a deeper moment for us to grapple with that and to ask, well, if we truly are interdependent, how can we best support each other as individuals and as a government? What do we need to do to ensure that people have the best shot at living a healthy and fulfilled life?
It certainly is bringing up a lot of inconvenient and important questions, some of which you mentioned. And on one hand, it's been very uplifting as a silver lining to see how much certain communities have rallied or coalesced, grown stronger as a result of this, where the importance of community and seeing each other's faces and so on has increased. And I was struck earlier today. I had a team call with my employees, and there was a very fast rotation where each person spoke about one thing they were proud of and one thing they were happy about before getting into the business matters. And what came up most often was seeing communities come together. That was the happy about point that came up the most. And I do want to talk about that. I'm going to ask you about remembering your anchors, and I have a whole host of other questions that I'd like to ask, but I'd also like to dig into COVID-19 just a little bit more, if you're open to it.
Sure.
And again, as a snapshot in time, as we speak, New York City's Javits Center is being turned into a disaster hospital for COVID-19 patients, or maybe overflow from other conditions. I don't know. I imagine it would probably be dedicated for COVID-19. There's a lot of movement right now. There are some people who would argue that the United States has really been caught on its heels in a lot of respects and has not taken aggressive enough actions from the playbooks of South Korea, etc., China, other places. If you were the benevolent dictator of the United States and your team came to you and asked what should be done at this point in time, is there anything that comes to mind that you would tell your team?
Well, yes, I would tell them about the three important principles that you have to make sure you adhere to in disaster response. That number one, you have to lead with science in your decision making and lead with scientists in your communication. That number two, you've got to be transparent with the public, even when it's painful, not only because that's how you build and maintain trust, which is one of the most important assets you have in fighting a crisis like this, but also because that transparency creates the accountability that you need as government. And the third thing I would tell them is that our job, and even more than that, our sacred responsibility in a crisis like this, when people are putting their lives on the line, is to make sure that we pull out all the stops to get resources to people on the front lines. And those are the doctors and nurses and healthcare workers in hospitals. Those are the public health workers in communities across the country who are trying to trace contacts and coming in contact with people who are ill. Those are the individuals who are impacted economically as we pull back on social interaction and as businesses shut down. Those are the three principles that have to guide us. And in particular, when I think about the circumstances in our hospitals, it's so deeply painful to me because we are encountering a pandemic that we haven't seen the likes of in over a century. And we are not prepared for it. We have certainly done some preparation for major disasters, but this is not a typical disaster. This is far greater in scale and scope. And so we right now, as we speak, have doctors and nurses who are reusing masks in hospitals, who are going to see patients, in some cases doing surgeries without masks, which is bad for the doctor and patient, but because there is no other option. We have hospitals that are running out of gowns and gloves. We have doctors who are trying to figure out how to take one ventilator and somehow rig it so that it can care for two patients at the same time because they're running out of ventilators. These are the realities that we're facing in our hospitals today in 2020 in the richest country in the world. And this is sobering. It's painful to recognize this, but that's the situation that we're in. What that means to me is that we have to do everything within our power, avail ourselves of every authority, and mobilize every resource that we have access to ensure that we close the gap between what those healthcare settings have and what they need. Because here's the truth. It's not just a moral responsibility we have to protect those on the front lines, but on a very practical level, as doctors and nurses start to get sick in larger and larger numbers because they don't have the protection they need when they're caring for sick patients, that also pulls people out of the workforce exactly when we need them in our hospitals, and it further deepens the crisis. So this is how I would frame the challenge to my team. These responses are never easy. I was in the administration in the federal government during the Ebola response and during the Zika response, and those were not easy either. We hadn't quite dealt with those kind of crises before. And so there are always stumbles, like in these instances. But the question is not, do you stumble? I think the more important question is, how do you get up? How do you get up quickly? And how do you learn from your mistakes and ensure that you are serving even better as a result of what you've learned?
Thank you. And feel free not to answer, or we can punt, but I'd be very curious, adhering to those three principles of crisis response. Since you're the benevolent dictator, you can on some level insist and enforce those three principles. At this point in time, what types of interventions or actions, whether statewide or nationwide, would you be considering implementing, knowing what you know?
Well, so there's a lot. I'll just mention a couple of things that come to mind.
We have all the time in the world. Fortunately, this isn't morning TV. So we have the luxury of space. Take all the time.
We have more than 30 seconds to make profound statements about the world. Okay, that's great. So a couple of things I would do. Number one, I would make sure that as a federal government that we were providing clear directives to states and localities about when to pull the trigger on various measures that they may take to protect their population, including closing schools, shutting down businesses, issuing shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders. One of the great challenges that states and local governments struggle with is how to make these decisions, based on what criteria. And what you see right now is a very uneven response, across the country. And so people are confused. They're asking, well, why is California issuing a stay-at-home order, but other states aren't, even though they may have a similar number of cases? It's because there's confusion, in part. And so that's one thing I would do, is to make sure that as a federal government, we were putting our nickel down, so to speak, and providing clear criteria to states and local governments about when to implement some of these restrictions. The second thing that I would do is I would take the responsibility as a federal government to make sure that we were filling the gaps in terms of materials and space that hospitals needed. That doesn't mean that we have to provide everything directly ourselves, but it does mean that we need to be responsible for solving the problem. So if, for example, New York State and California State and Washington State are short on masks, it would be inefficient for them to spend all of this time looking for gloves, calling vendors, and effectively competing against each other for a limited supply. This is a place where it makes sense, actually, for the federal government to step in and to use its power to procure what's needed. And so that's the second place where I would exercise authority.